First of all, let me ask a little bit about your early life. When did you first think that writing may be something that you'd like to end up doing?
Well, my mother had the ambition to be a writer, so I'm sure I copied this from her. And by the time I was 10 or 11 years old, I had sort of declared that I was going to be a writer. I mean, without, you know, how do you say that? I mean, I have a child now who says the same thing, but I mean, on what basis? So, and I always think about that, you know, the fact that the inclination to do it was there long before there was anything resembling any kind of accomplishment.
Who did you like reading when you were a kid?
Oh, you know, when I was a kid, I tended to read through most of the childhood classics. My mother had furnished our rooms with a set of, I don't know who published them, but they were terrific books. And they were all works that were in public domain, and everything from, you know, Huckleberry Finn through Black Beauty and stuff like that. And I really did, you know, Uncle Remus I read through. A whole series of American classics as a kid, mostly because these books were literally situated in a cubbyhole above my bed.
When did you first take your hand to doing it yourself?
Oh, I think when I was in 7th grade, I wrote a long piece of fiction, which was exemplary in every regard, except the fact that it was almost completely plagiarized from something I'd read at school. So.
I understand you edited your newspaper at New Trier?
Yes, I did. Actually, I started that even in grade school. But at New Trier, I was the editor-in-chief of the New Trier News. The sponsor was a guy named Robert Boyle, who had been my English teacher as well. And I just saw him recently. He reminded me, of course, of many things that I had forgotten.
So a major influence on you? Is it?
Well, he certainly was a great teacher, and he certainly was a tough critic. And since I had little inclination to be a tough critic of myself, it was a good exercise.
You indicated that Dickens was a good influence for you, somebody that maybe at the time when you're writing he wasn't exactly, well, maybe making an influence on you, but as it turned out, he probably did.
Right.
Why is that?
Well, I think, in retrospect, that the stuff in Dickens that I should have been most appreciative of, I tended to dismiss because I regarded it as easy, meaning that I could at least understand how he had been able to do that. Not only is one seldom a prophet in his own land, but sometimes you're not even a prophet with yourself. And like many writers, I tend to be, more astounded by what I can't do than what I can. So it took a long time for me to realize that a lot of the stuff that was really emerging from me had sort of been formed in the shadow of the Dickens I'd read. I read a ton of Dickens. So again, that bookshelf above my bed was full of Dickens, and I can starting oddly with A Christmas Carol, and I've probably read most of Dickens in my life by now, almost all of it.
He had these wonderfully robust characters, very strong characters, and at the same time he still had a very good plot developed.
Well, that's that and the sort of the Dickensian twists, the role of the unexpected, and the way the supposedly unexpected ends up revealing character, so that it is really part of the plan.
How do you see that coming out in your work?
I hope the same way, I hope that the unexpected goes to reveal character, so that it's both entertaining in the sense that it's almost as surprising as life, and yet, looking backward, you can say that that's plausible and consistent and indeed, as I said, a revelation.
Talking about surprises, I was expecting you to start out originally, when I started reading about you, I expected you to go right to law school, but you taught creative writing
Right.
at Stanford.
Right.
What led you there first and then to the law?
Well, I mean, it was a lifelong ambition to be a writer, and you know, in retrospect, Jack, some of that has to do with probably not wanting to follow in my father's footsteps. He was a doctor, and you know, and we had some troubles in our relationship, and so I wanted a different path, and of course, you know, like all kids, I knew how to divide and conquer my parents, so I decided to fasten on what my mother wanted. And it was you know, I was into my young adulthood before I really began to sort of contemplate what life was going to be like only as a writer. And, you know, it's obvious that even now, as I go on practicing law, that there's been a sort of, I guess, deep idea in there that men are obliged to be professionals. And I don't know if, I mean, none of this was really conscious at the time. I did not want to be an English professor, and that was the direction in which I was headed. And I also was profoundly interested in the law, as I remain profoundly interested in the law.
Why is the law so fascinating? I have a good number of friends who are attorneys.
You know, it's just, look, the fundamental task of the law is to try to make our lives more reasonable, our social interaction more reasonable. And accepting that the world is hazardous and often unfair, you know, the law's job is to try to improve on that a little bit. And trying to regulate a society as diverse and complex as ours, with needs that are, you know, incredibly varied, it's an amazingly difficult task.
How did you juggle writing and law school at the same time?
Well, you know, I went to law school promising myself that I wouldn't stop writing. Now, whether I would have been good to that pledge or not, I don't know. I think Annette, my wife, would tell you that I probably would have been. I don't have quite as high an opinion of my willpower, but as it happened, I ended up with a book contract. And so, you know, the contract was to write a book about law school. So my freshman year, my first year, my 1L year, I had no choice but to write. And it was a great cathartic activity. I don't know if I'd have found the time for it otherwise. Certainly during that year, given the sort of neurotic, obsessive mess I was in terms of law school, and with the writing of a book crammed in on the side, I was as busy that year as I have ever been. Then my second year really was consumed with sort of getting the manuscript and the galleys and ready for publication. And third year, I don't know if I wrote that much, although there are pieces, there are old making, so I probably was working on, I went back to working on fiction. So the time was there. You know, again, much of third year was consumed with the publication of 1L, which was a bit of an emotional jolt.
What led back to Illinois? You went to work in the prosecutor's office here, the federal prosecutor's office.
Right.
And that ended up being a very active time in that office.
Right.
What was the? You mentioned this in your acceptance speech down at Springfield about how it was such a great thing that you came back to Illinois.
Right.
You've always been thinking about the state.
Right. I was, you know, I was a born and bred Chicagoan, You know, I had 4 grandparents who were Chicagoans and 2 parents who'd been raised in the city, and I myself had lived inside, you know, Chicago for my first 13 years, and my parents had then moved to the suburbs, but my principal attachments always were to Chicago. And I discovered when I left to be educated, I first went to the east, then the west, back to the east, that Chicago and Illinois had a remarkable claim on me, that even living in places as beautiful as San Francisco, that sort of the norm to me was, you know, represented by the prairies and the sort of stillness and the flatness. You know, I was just deeply attached to everything I had known here in my early life. And when Annette and I, excuse me, forgive me.
No problem.
When Annette and I had gotten down to the business of figuring out where we were going to go, she'd wanted to stay in Boston. That was out of the question as far as I was concerned. Law school had been much too dreadful an experience for me to be able to come to terms with Boston. And I had realistic objections to the Boston environment, which you know, had to do with the sort of ingrained class structure of Boston, which, even though I was a Harvard Law School graduate, I really resented. Then I wanted to consider going back to San Francisco, and that didn't want to go back there. She said, it's too crazy. You know, and again, it was sort of a Midwestern reasonableness that she was craving. So we sort of decided, well, we'll come back to Chicago at least to start. And again, as I said in my acceptance speech, you know, the fact of the matter is that I still think we in the Midwest are far more democratic. Chicago has been a city where for generations people who've, you know, come to work hard and make their way. And those who do have often succeeded without regard to you know, the notion that, you know, people like you aren't supposed to make it, and which are, you know, those are sort of ingrained feelings in other parts of the United States. And I really do think this is the easiest place to rise and prosper in the country. And again, we're just not as goofy as they are on either of the other coasts. We're not quite as proud of our eccentricities as the Southerners are. And you know, it's home.
When you came to the prosecutor's office here in Chicago, I was just getting into news in Illinois, and it turned out that a judge from just next door to me was up here wearing a tape recorder.
Sure.
And he's been Brock
Sure.
Block,
Right.
a guy I know fairly well from
Right.
down there.
Right.
You came in on one of the biggest corruption cases
Right.
in American legal history. What were you finding as you went into the judicial system here in Chicago and Cook County that was so corrupt, so wrong?
Well, you know, my years as a prosecutor, I often say that I got a proctologist's view of the legal profession because I spent virtually my entire career prosecuting lawyers. I started as the junior prosecutor in the prosecution of William J. Scott, then our sitting Attorney General and a candidate for the United States Senate. And I moved on from there to the Board of Tax Appeals here, a local real estate assessment agency where lawyers were bribing the hearing officers and decision-making officials. And then finally, by sort of a combination of lucky accident and will, I got involved in Greylord. And, you know, we have an esteemed tradition of corruption in Chicago. It, you know, has been open and notorious since early in the century. And to some extent that made the investigation of corruption easier because it was a kind of open secret. I really don't think that this city was that much more corrupt than other cities, especially those east of the Mississippi. West of the Mississippi, in the West, there's been, there really are different traditions that I think have to do with the nature of the way those places were settled. But what I found was, of course, like many others, I thought it was a disaster. Again, I think my theory about Greylord was that, unlike the Cook County Board of Tax Appeals, where, frankly, there's been a scandal every 20 years going back to the 30s, the courts were amenable to complete reform. And that is because there were sort of old-time assumptions at work there. And I thought, being a judge is a job that carries such esteem that if you can create a situation where those who sit on the bench are no longer tainted by suspicions, then the good judges, the many good judges, would prevail, and the system there would be reformed. And I frankly think that's what happened. I think not only was Greylord great law enforcement, it was also, although I don't think this is the role of prosecution, it was also great social reform.
You're talking about some of the traditions in different cities, and one of the things that seems to come up here a lot is somebody takes care of somebody else who takes care of somebody else, and so on. And that would seem to be a natural for these kinds of things to happen, fixing traffic tickets and so on and so forth. How do the stories, or do the stories in some of your work like Greylord and other cases, find their way into your novels?
Well, I mean, they obviously have a huge influence. Greylord was, I got an email from a reader the other day, a sort of naive reader, who said, do you know that your novel Personal Injuries is almost an exact duplicate of the case Greylord in Chicago? And I wrote her back to explain that, yes, I had started from that place, and that since having lived the life, I thought I was entitled to use some of those experiences. At the basic level, obviously, there is a lot of stealing from life. More, but it's more the milieu, of what I've observed than specific incidents that end up informing the fiction.
Just in reading Presumed Innocent, I keep seeing character studies of people up here that, I do some work in here, and I go to the General Assembly is one of my other jobs, and some of the people are almost ripped right out of life. It's scary how much they resemble real people that I know.
Yeah. I don't do a lot of Romana Clef type writing, though. Very few of my characters are, that's so-and-so. And every now and then there are minor characters whom people think they recognize and they're correct. But certainly no major character.
Not like deconstructing Harry.
Yeah. No, it would be, I would find it inhibiting as a writer to be bound by reality.
I'm curious, you're very busy in Greylord and all the other cases that were going on here. How did you manage to keep writing? What was it you wanted to say in your writing?
I can never overemphasize the importance of the fact that my wife believed in this enterprise. And, I'm like every other person who's married. If you want me to complain about my spouse, I can do that too. But, the fact of the matter is that there were just a number of junctures where Annette was incredibly supportive of my continuing to write, in part, as she herself really confesses, because she felt somewhat cheated when I went to law school. She had married a writer, and I think for reasons of her own, wanted to be married to somebody in the arts. And, it had been sort of a double cross as far as she was concerned when I went to law school. And Not that she didn't support that as well, but she was really happy to see me stay in touch with that part of myself, so that when I came to her in 1982, at the time when we were living on a government salary, and I said, you know, dear, I want to take $2,000 and buy one of these things called a computer, because I really think it's the only way I'm ever going to be able to finish this book. You know, that $2,000 was probably everything we were going to save that year. And she said, oh, I think that's a great idea. Go ahead and do it. So I went out and bought a used computer for $2,000 in 1982. And without it, I would never have finished Presumed Innocent. You know, and it was Annette who encouraged me to leave the U.S. Attorney's Office and give up a secure income and finish Presumed Innocent. And you know, first of all, I owe my wife just an enormous debt. Beyond that, what did I want to say? I think it's there. You know, I think that throughout my life there's been a sort of increasing vision of the extraordinary tension in life and the law, that between the way that the law's ideals and the moral reasoning that are part of it do help to shape us as people. And then there's the ultimate paradox that the categories that the law derives can never fully contain the extraordinary you know, variety of human experience. So it's both, you know, inspirational and limiting.
And it's a place where we have such natural tensions, because we have people in many cases who are at their very worst, who are doing their very worst, because otherwise how would they become involved in the court system or
Right.
the judicial system?
Right. Although the assumption that, and certainly the last book was written to this theme, that even the worst folks are bad all the time, is not a valid one. You know, I can give you 100 examples. The one that comes to my mind right now is Brian Dugan, who was the man who confessed to the murders of Cruz and Hernandez. And of course he was never willing to put himself, not the murders of Cruz and Hernandez. Brian Dugan confessed to the murder of Janine Nicarico, for which Cruz and Hernandez at the time had both been sentenced to death, and he knew darn well they hadn't committed the crime. And in spite of the fact that he is, by his own admission, a stone killer, there was significant evidence that he felt some kind of moral commitment to not seeing these men pay the price for a crime he knew he alone had committed. And that's fascinating to the writer in me, as well as the lawyer, that you know, how does somebody who really cannot help himself from murdering have that kind of, you know, corridor of decency in his heart?
Well, you know that case very well because of your work with Hernandez.
Sure.
And I'm curious about that too. What sold you on that case? I know you do some pro bono work.
Yeah, I've done pro bono work since really Judge Fitzgerald, who's now candidate for our Supreme Court, was initially responsible for involving me at 26th Street. And from the platform of that experience, I've always remained active in doing pro bono work of one kind or another. Some in the juvenile courts. Certainly Hernandez was a long-term commitment. Basically, what happened is that Alex's defense lawyers came to me and said, you know, we've tried the case. We know there are some areas where our judgments are subject to dispute. We'd like another lawyer to come in and look at the case. And my initial reaction was, okay, you're telling me there's this innocent man and he's been convicted twice of this murder he didn't commit. And I said, first of all, it'll be a long time before you convince me that that's true. I said, but even if you convince me, I will never be able to convince an appellate court. And, I was wrong on both counts. I read the record. I was shocked and white hot with anger. I regard the second and third Hernandez trials as complete travesties. It's an overused phrase, an overused word. It was disgraceful. And, the people who frankly have, I think that our Supreme and Appellate Court functioned in really the highest traditions of the law in that case. They never failed, either Alex or even ultimately Rolando. The trial courts, because of the misbehavior of the prosecutors, the trial judges have tended to get a pass. They shouldn't. They shouldn't. What went on in those courtrooms should have been enough to shock the conscience of any jurist. Certainly it shocked me. And, I went back to these lawyers and I said, well, you didn't tell me they cheated. I said, you could convict any innocent person any number of times if you do things, the way they were done in those courtrooms.
Timing couldn't be better. Okay. All right. Well, as we were talking, we're in a situation now where he was one of the 13 people
Right.
who's been taken off death row of Illinois.
Right.
Anthony Porter came within 2 days of it.
Right.
I think Willie Enoch, who just passed away in
Mm-hmm.
prison, came within a couple of days as
Mm-hmm.
well. What is wrong with the judicial system that we have a situation like this, not only in Illinois but around the country, Scott?
Well, as you know, the governor has appointed me to the commission that is studying reform of our death penalty system, and I'm always a little cautious, therefore, about what I have to say. I do not regard the number of exonerations in this state as any indication that the justice system in Illinois is worse than it is elsewhere. I think there are common problems. And, as again, maybe it's a Midwestern tradition, but we do have an openness to recognizing our own faults. And it is, although each of these convictions, wrongful convictions, arose a different way, there is some credit due to especially our courts of review, for being willing to recognize these errors. Just talking about Hernandez, which is a case where I feel free to talk about what happened. I think we have to recognize that the gravest crimes often excite the deepest passions. And once those passions are set free, it is very hard to do dispassionate justice. One of the things that shocked me in Hernandez, reading the record, the last time Alex was convicted, I really believed sincerely, and the appellate court and I went around and around and around about this during the oral argument. When I got up to argue Alex's case, there was no question that they were going to reverse that case. The only question that those three justices had was this case so barren of evidence, should they just declare him legally acquitted from that court? And they ultimately decided not to do that. But it was a very close question. Certainly it was incomprehensible to me that a jury if they really understood the term reasonable doubt, could possibly have convicted. There was no evidence in the case of any consequence. And I realized, as I thought about it, I mean, how could these guys have been convicted 3 separate times? How could that have happened? I realized that the burden of proof had been tilted against them. The crime was so awful that the jurors had said to themselves, I believe, and this is pure speculation on my part, but it's certainly deeply held belief, they had said to themselves, we are not going to put these guys back on the street unless we're sure that what happened is not going to happen again. We don't want it to be our child or somebody else's child. And instead of guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, I think those cases become, in the minds of jurors, when the crime is heinous enough, innocent beyond a reasonable doubt. Of course, you know, Rolando's acquittal came in a bench trial, and that's appropriate. That's something that many defense lawyers involved in these cases talked about at great length. The reality that, you know, probably the only way we're going to win these cases is in front of a bench, because, and it's got to be, of course, a truly objective judge. So I think that we have to look really carefully at the nature of the kinds of cases that we typically think of as being death cases, because we start off, if the crime is awful enough to merit the death penalty, we start off with a problem in terms of doing objective justice.
I know you can't presume as to what the outcome of the task force's recommendations will be, but maybe I can ask, what do you think of Governor Ryan's decision to call a moratorium to take a very serious look at the issue?
One can say that I am not objective about the governor because you know, he's been kind enough to appoint me to this commission. I also sit on the State Police Merit Board as by virtue of his appointment, and of course I have the honor that we're here discussing, which for which, you know, the governor also has some role, and I'm grateful to him for that as well. But I am a lifelong Democrat, and I think that George Ryan's conduct in the governor's office has been nothing other than courageous. And certainly to do what he did with the moratorium was an extraordinary act that has literally stirred the conscience of America. And I am frankly bothered that there is not greater public acclaim, because you know, we have gone in this country, you know, we're all in this sort of postmodern politics where, you know, the politicians spin, and we're aware of that. And I would like to see greater praise given to really courageous, principled decisions, and I surely believe that this was one of them.
I think this is, just from interviewing him over the years, I think this was a guy who sat up all night and worried about what he had, the kinds of decisions he had to make, and he just couldn't convince himself that all the facts were in.
I mean, I don't know Governor Ryan very well at all, but I will tell you that he strikes me as a person of deep decency. And I think somebody whose career in politics has been based principally on the notion of wanting to help people. And I think the idea of what was involved in you know, deciding to put somebody to death in a circumstance that's been fraught with error, you know, he made a courageous, conscientious decision.
Surprised by the national outpouring of interest in the case and the way it's things are starting to pick up in terms of publicity and study around the country?
Yeah, I'm very surprised, frankly. I think that what's going on is that, you know, we've had the death penalty has been reinstitutionalized in this country for, it's getting to be about 25 years. And I think what's happening is people are just looking back at the track record and saying, you know, well, this is not exactly what I had in mind. You know, the death penalty is just a profoundly difficult issue. I have gone back and forth throughout my career in the law, and even before then, in terms of what my own opinions are about the death penalty and its morality and you know, even its practicality. So I don't think that this is an issue that we can ever take, you know, for granted on one side or the other. I mean, the fact of the matter is that both proponents and opponents have deeply felt and, frankly, in my opinion, sensible things to say. But I think that the mood of reassessment, again, is it's sort of a compliment to America, and we in Illinois have the right to be proud that this probing of the American conscience began here. And again, I think we have to be unbelievably grateful to our governor.
I need to get back to the literary topic. Were you surprised by the way that this book took off? I mean,
surprised is not. I mean, there isn't that a word in the spoken language of any nation that could possibly comprehend my shock. I mean, I always tell the same story, and I mentioned before that Annette encouraged me to take this time away from the law to finish the book, and I did it. But I knew it wasn't perfect, and I had 3 weeks before I started here at Sonnenschein in private practice. And I knew that if this manuscript went the way of every other piece of fiction I wrote, that it would, you know, come to nothing but wastebasket lining. But on the other hand, if I painted the porch, there would at least be something to show for this time away from the law. So I painted the porch. And when Presumed Innocent happened, and it happened in just an explosive way, inside of, I'd say 3 or 4 weeks, it was clear that, you know, New York was, after years of holding its nose, suddenly at my feet, you know, and Hollywood, and you know, I was standing right outside this door when I got a phone call from Hollywood, and it was my agent, and I was being offered more money for the film rights to Presumed Innocent than I had made in all the years that I had worked as an assistant United States attorney put together. And I said, what should I do? He said, turn it down, there'll be more. And I said, okay, no. And I put down the phone. I was, you know, I was both elated by my independence, and I was just overcome by the, you know, the ironies of this. It was a shocking period. I wish for every human being the opportunity to go through something, you know, as impossible as what happened to me and us and my family with Presumed Innocent.
Several more great books have followed. How do you keep raising the bar to get the next story out?
I know what I'm doing as a writer. That doesn't mean I can achieve it, but I have a very sure sense from all of my many years in the wilderness of what I wanna be doing, and you know, as far as I'm concerned, it's a constant effort to perfect craft, not only sentence by sentence, which is where I really concentrated as a younger person, but more and more in the whole, the organic, you know, sort of creature that's the novel. And you know, there are advantages to getting older. You've learned something along the way. So I just want to keep telling the tale.